Hello, and welcome to the History of the Railways, a podcast with the ridiculous goal of telling the story of the railways across the world. Season 1, Episode 10, The Grand Junction Railway, A Fight for Control. Over the last few episodes, I've been doing a mini-series on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, and the last episode brought us to the early part of 1831 by looking at the opening day and some early loco developments. By then, the Liverpool and Manchester had proven beyond any reasonable doubt that railways carrying both passengers and goods traffic could be successful. But 6 years later, a sceptical observer of Britain's railways would be forgiven for thinking that they were purely local affairs. In today's episode, we dive into the railway that broke that pattern, the Grand Junction Railway. The GJR linked Liverpool and Manchester with Birmingham and formed the first major part of the national rail network that survives today. More than that, though, it was also the first step into the professionalisation of the railway network. The men who drove it weren't genius engineers, they were businessmen. They'd been part of the group hooked by the local benefits of the L&MR, but amongst them were men who had stopped thinking purely as merchants looking for new markets for their goods, or faster ways to move raw materials around, and had seen the opportunities that would come with building a transportation network. Without men like them, railway networks across the world would never have been more than purely local things. Of course, they couldn't have done it without genius engineers, so today we'll meet another of them properly, Joseph Locke. We'll get to see him emerge from under his old boss George Stephenson and learn exactly how thrilled old George was about it. Oddly, the GJR doesn't get a lot of attention in history books, so let's see what we've been missing. But before we get to that, we need to answer our last trivia question. On the last episode, I asked the name of the highest railway bridge in the world. And, with apologies for my pronunciation, the answer is Chenab Railway Bridge in Kashmir. As I record this in June 2023, that is the world's highest railway bridge. An arch bridge over a gorge in the Himalayas, it's 359 metres above the riverbed. The railway itself isn't up and running yet, but the rails, set at India's broad gauge of 5 foot 6 inches, were laid in March of this year. The highest railway bridge on an operational line, and again apologies for the pronunciation, is Najia in China, which stands 305 metres high. OK, on with the show. There's a great animated map by the Cambridge University Population Studies Group, which I'll link to at historyoftherailways.com episode 10 and on social media. It shows the track covering Britain from the early 1800s all the way up to the 2000s, and it's a great way to visualise both the railway mania we'll be talking about in an upcoming episode and the beaching slash and burn in the 1960s. But the key thing to see for today's purposes is that in 1836, 6 years after the opening of the L&MR, there are no lines joining different regions of the country. There were lines in Scotland and Wales as well as England, with a concentration in the northeast, all of which were very important to the economic and social life of the areas they served, but they were all local. 6 years after it opened, the L&MR was still the longest line in Britain at a mere 30 miles, and it was the only one connecting two major population centres. If you wanted a longer line, you'd have had to look to the US, where the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company had opened their 136-mile line between Charleston and Hamburg, opened in 1833. But in 1837, Britain's railways went national. The Grand Junction Railway laid 82 3/4 miles of new track from Birmingham to a midpoint on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, connecting all three cities at once. And for anyone who missed episode 6, I know they weren't technically cities at this point, but there's only so many times I can find another way of saying major conurbation without sounding like a complete idiot. And more than just linking those three cities, the Grand Junction was planned from the get-go as a link in a national chain of railways, the first piece of a true rail network. So let's start with Birmingham. Birmingham's a third of the way up Britain, 100 miles north of London and 230 miles south of Edinburgh. Throughout the 18th century, the town had become a centre of manufacturing. We've seen in earlier episodes that Matthew Boulton and James Watt had their base there, and drove much of the improvement in steam power from it. But Boulton and Watt's heavy machinery was far from the only thing the town produced. While northern towns like Liverpool and Manchester tended to specialise in textiles, Birmingham became famous for a dizzying array of products, including buckles and buttons, guns, pens, jewellery and toys. By the 19th century, it was widely considered the workshop of the world. But unusually for most big cities, it didn't stand on any major waterways, so as the canal network grew, Birmingham came to be the meeting point for many of them. And in the early 1820s, when forward-thinking folk were starting to consider railways, it probably seemed natural for Birmingham to occupy a similar position. So, in 1823, a group of Birmingham businessmen travelled to Liverpool. We don't know a lot about them, except that their names were Foster, Spooner and Sparrow, which sounds like a law firm or the start of a joke, but it isn't. Assuming they travelled by one of the well-established stagecoach services that ran between the two cities each day, services with grand names like the Aurora or the more entertaining Bang Up, then the journey would have taken them about 13 hours. They could have shaved an hour off that if they were posh enough to take the mail coach. They'd come to agree with the like-minded men in Liverpool to sponsor an Act of Parliament for a railway linking the two towns, or almost linking them. Rather than deal with the difficulty of crossing the River Mersey, the northern terminus of the line they proposed was at Birkenhead on the south bank of the River Mersey. The idea was well received, and the combined Birmingham and Liverpool group submitted a bill to Parliament. But remember, this is in 1823. The Stockton and Darlington had managed to get their line approved a couple of years earlier on their second attempt, but it hadn't been built yet, and the Liverpool and Manchester were still waiting for William James to write up the results of his survey. I haven't been able to find any record of the debate, but apparently the bill was given a good kicking in Parliament. It was definitely rejected. As we've seen, though, this wasn't unusual, and not wanting to be beaten at the first hurdle, they tried again in 1826, only to be knocked back a second time, and this time they accepted it. The idea was shelved, and the Birmingham group disappeared from our story. 3 years later, with work on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway well underway, and the Rainhill trials under the belt, some of the directors of the L&MR decided the time was right to make another attempt. Key amongst them were John Moss, Joseph Sanders and Charles Lawrence. The new proposal included two big changes to the previous attempts. First, they'd changed the line so that instead of stopping short in Birkenhead, it would cross the Mersey and enter Liverpool itself. They'd do this by heading further east to Runcorn, where the River Mersey was much narrower. The second idea was to split the Act into two. One company would be formed to build a line from Liverpool to Chorlton, and another from Birmingham to Chorlton, Chorlton being a convenient midpoint between the two. The committee appointed George Stephenson as the principal engineer across the combined line, with two key men under him, John Urpeth Rastrick, who we met in episode 4 when he was a judge at the Rainhill trials, and Joseph Locke, another name we know, one of Stephenson's most trusted assistants. Rastrick was responsible for surveying and planning the southern half of the line, Locke for the northern. Splitting the Acts probably sounded like a great plan, but the flaw became obvious when they were presented to Parliament in 1830 and the southern half was rejected, while the northern looked like it might pass. If that had carried on, then I imagine the Liverpool party would have continued to build the northern section and keep trying to get approval for the lower part of the line, but we certainly wouldn't be talking about a Grand Junction Railway. A Liverpool to Chorlton line would have been yet another local railway, and not a very useful one at that. As it turned out, though, the Liverpool men weren't put in that position. Although their bill looked to be doing okay in Parliament, it was now 1830, and as you'll remember if you listened to me getting excited about near revolution in episode 9, Parliament was dissolved only 2 months after the L&MR opened, and with it went all the bills that it was still discussing, including the potential Liverpool to Chorlton Railway. After licking their wounds for a while, and presumably I suppose concentrating on their new operational line, the Liverpool party kicked things off again in 1832. In October of that year, the committee issued a new prospectus. In it, while trying half-heartedly to reassure the share-buying public that they'd been planning for all these false starts, the committee refers to the railway for the first time with the name by which it would be known to history. The undertaking was only postponed and is now revised under its new title of the Grand Junction Railway. The new prospectus also made two other important changes. One, they abandoned the idea of getting 2 acts passed, reverting to a single line with a single act. And 2, they changed the northern part of the route again. The last attempt had moved east from Birkenhead to the Runcorn Gap. This time they proposed going even further inland to a town called Warrington. Warrington's about 6 miles east of the Runcorn Gap and sits on a point where the Mersey has narrowed to a mere 30 metres. If you were building a line coming from Birmingham to the south, it's an ideal place to cross the river. But much more importantly for the purposes of the Liverpool party, since their abortive bill in 1830, not only had the Liverpool and Manchester started operating, but another new railway had been opened with a junction onto the L&MR, the Warrington and Newton Railway. The WNR was only 4¼ miles long, but its placement was perfect for Moss and his fellow committee members. It had opened in June 1831 and made a connection to the L&MR a month later on the 25th of July. As the name suggests, it ran south from what was then Newton Junction and is now Earlstown Station to the town of Warrington. Newton Junction is almost exactly midway along the Liverpool and Manchester, just over 1.5 miles west of Parkside, where Huskisson was killed on the opening day. Despite being peculiarly well served by stations, Newton was never much more than a village, although several carriage and loco manufacturers, including Charles Taylor's Vulcan foundry, made it their base because of the ease of access to the railways. Warrington, on the other hand, was a sizable market town with a growing industrial base and a population of between 20 and 36,000, depending which boundaries you're using. But let's not kid ourselves. The WNR was a small affair. I suppose it might sound a bit harsh, probably wouldn't really deserve any mention at all in the history of the railways. Just one more local railway, and a small one at that. But in my mind, it's the little WNR that's the key to seeing inside the thinking of the men of the Grand Junction Railway. It's why this group of men appear in so many railway acts, and why I think the GJR doesn't get enough credit in railway history. Because they saw an opportunity in the WNR, or more precisely 2 opportunities. The first one was the more obvious one. Rather than making their own line all the way to Liverpool, as they originally planned, they could connect to the WNR and get access to both Liverpool and Manchester. So, by the time the prospectus was issued in October 1832, the committee had decided on the main line as it would eventually be built, and when it called out all of the principal stations along the way, the first named station showed what they were thinking. From Warrington, Hertford, Crewe, Whitmore, Stafford, Wolverhampton and Bescot to Birmingham, Curzon Street. And 7 months later, on the 6th of May 1833, when their Act was formally approved by Parliament, they were explicit about their intention to connect to the little WNR. The long title of the Act was An Act for Making a Railway from the Warrington and Newton Railway at Warrington in the county of Lancaster to Birmingham in the county of Warwick, to be called the Grand Junction Railway. Although, as we'll see, that didn't completely lock them into using the WNR, it did mean changing it would need a whole new Act. The newly formed Board of Directors wasted no time in getting on with the job. On the 22nd of May, just a couple of weeks after the Act was approved, they held a meeting and instructed Joseph Locke to start work on a 10-mile stretch of line from the River Weaver to Preston Brook. Hang on a minute, why Joseph Locke? Why not George Stephenson, or even John Earthworth Rastrick? All 3 engineers who'd been involved in the 1830 split line were still nominally in place, with the same division of labour they'd had previously. But Rastrick seems to have been withdrawing already, and would be gone by the end of the year. Stephenson, while retaining overall control, was acting more and more remotely, leaving Locke as the man on the ground. As I said earlier, we've met Joseph Locke several times over recent episodes. Up until this point, he's been Stephenson's pupil, pure and simple, but from mid-1833, we get an idea of the tension that was creeping into their relationship, and which would pretty soon destroy it for good. By the time the Grand Junction Railway obtained its Act, Locke had been working for George Stephenson for almost 10 years. Stephenson took Joseph on as an apprentice when he was 18 or 19, as a favour to an old friend he'd known when he worked in the colliery. He'd worked on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, supervising the eastern half, before being moved to take over the Liverpool end of the line after George got rid of Charles Vignoles. But between then and now, their relationship had started to sour. In 1829, a disagreement between George Stephenson and the board of the L&MR about who should be able to direct his assistants had ended with Locke loyally resigning from that railway to support his mentor, but it doesn't seem to have sat easily with him. Luckily for him, the directors, including those who'd go on to form the core of the GJR, had obviously understood that his resignation was driven by the older man, and continued to think highly of Locke. He took part in the opening day ceremonies on the L&MR. In fact, he was on the footplate of Rocket when it ran down and killed William Huskisson. And as we've seen today, they were more than happy to involve him in several of the various plans for the Grand Junction. But the fact that this group recognised Locke as an impressive engineer in his own right, and treated him in many ways as independent from Stephenson, ultimately proved to be a double-edged sword. The opportunities they gave him undoubtedly launched his solo career, but they also led to the irrevocable breakdown of his relationship with his old mentor. In 1832, this group, wearing their hats as directors of the L&MR, were concerned with the new tunnel that was being built from Edgehill to the new Lime Street station. George Stephenson was still the engineer for the LNMR, and one of his assistants, William Allcard, was responsible for the new tunnel. Remembering that Joseph Locke had supervised the original tunnels from Edge Hill to Crown Street and Wapping Docks, the directors asked him to give them an independent assessment of the work that was going on in the new tunnel. This was a bit odd, since Locke was still working for George Stephenson, just not on the LNMR, but he investigated and discovered that there really was a problem. In a weird twist of fate, his report to the directors made it clear that Stephenson was guilty of the very mistake he'd accused Vignoles of 4 years earlier. The pilot borings for the tunnels were out of alignment, and if they'd been left to carry on, they wouldn't have joined up. This was a serious embarrassment for Stephenson, and must have been more than a little awkward for Locke. Jump forward a year, and Locke was still working under Stephenson on the Grand Junction, but the tension between them was obvious even to the board. In September 1833, the board minutes record, the arrangement of certain difficulties said to exist between Messrs. Stephenson and Locke was recommended to the good offices of the chairman and deputy chairman. Norman Webster, in his book Britain's First Trunk Line, which has been an excellent source for this episode, thinks that these difficulties were based on money, that Locke was annoyed that he was the only engineer acting in a full capacity, while he was being paid only £100 a year. Stephenson and Rastrick, though they weren't active on the line, were getting four-figure salaries. George, for example, was awarded a salary of £2,000 when he was made overall engineer. As I've said in previous episodes, these were huge sums of money at the time, so it's perfectly credible that they'd be the source of friction. If money were the only problem, though, it would probably have gone away the following month when the board noted that Mr. Locke be appointed engineer under Mr. Stephenson, with the special care of the Liverpool end of the line, but with the superintendence of the whole in the absence of, or when required by, the principal engineer, and that he be allowed a salary of £800 per year. They also allowed him £200 to cover expenses, and Locke was perfectly happy with this, describing it as beyond my expectations in every way in a letter to a friend. As far as I'm concerned, I guess that the responsibility they gave him was almost as important as the money. In December, William Allcard was appointed assistant engineer under George on the southern half of the line. As part of his offer of employment, it was made clear to him that Locke's conditions took precedence. He took the job, and there's no record of any objection on his part. In fact, the two men would work together on a number of lines, both in Britain and abroad, for years to come. Allcard doesn't seem to have borne a grudge against Locke at all for the report on the Lime Street Tunnel. Sadly, the same can't be said for George Stephenson. The truth is that the troubles between Stephenson and Locke on the Grand Junction, and I'm afraid this isn't the end of them, look like they boiled down to ego, the younger man wanting to make his own mark, and the older man refusing to recognise him as an equal. For now, though, Locke was satisfied with his 8-fold pay increase, the clear authority he'd been given, and the space that Stephenson's distracted attention gave him. I said earlier that the WNR is the key to seeing how the thinking behind the Grand Junction Railway involved two important steps. The first was connecting to the smaller railway and avoiding having to build their own line, although as we'll see that wasn't quite the saving they'd have thought. The second was how you'd go about using the other railway. As we saw back in episode 3 on the Stockton and Darlington, the original idea for many railway companies at this time was to build the railroad and charge other people or companies to operate services on it, the model that was used on the toll roads and canals. But that evolved quickly, and, like the S&DR, most companies turned to a mixed model, where they allowed other operators on the line, but ran trains themselves as well. So if you were running your own trains, and were connecting to another railway, how should you handle it? Well, the solution the GJR directors came to with the Warrington and Newton was simple. They'd buy it. It was an approach they'd use repeatedly, sometimes in their role as Grand Junction directors, often in other railways they came to own. So in November 1833, they opened negotiations to buy the Warrington and Newton Railway. Several of the directors of the Grand Junction were also directors of the WNR, as were both Joseph Locke and George Stephenson, out of interest. But there were nowhere near enough of them to force any decision onto the other company. The WNR directors were open to the idea of a buyout, but given that the list of original owners in their act is almost as long as the line itself, getting them all to agree to a sale would have been a hard job under any circumstances. It was made even harder when some of them realised that they could hold the GJR to ransom. They demanded a premium of 25% above the value of their shares. The GJR directors rejected both that first price and a slightly lower demand for £114.06 for each £100 share, and negotiations dragged on. on and off all the way through the early part of 1834, until the GJR directors let it be known that they were giving up on the other line. They instructed Joseph Locke to carry out a full survey and produce costs to build a new stretch of line that would run parallel to the WNR and allow the Grand Junction to avoid travelling over the smaller railway's metals. Webster believes that the GJR were serious about the other line. They might have been, but for my money it was a bluff, and if they were bluffing, then they played a blinder. John Moss let it be known that the new line would save 6 miles and 3 inclined planes, a most desirable object, for the prodigal waste of steam power which is caused by these inclines will be unnecessary. And in November 1834, a full year after they'd rejected the original price from the WNR, Locke presented a report to the GJR board with a price for building the alternative line, and the board minutes record that it was resolved that the new line be approved and adopted. So why do I think it was a bluff? Well, I'm sure the Grand Junction were prepared to build it if they had to, but they were fixated throughout this period on 2 things: opening on time and controlling costs as far as possible. Building a new line would have given them issues on both counts. They hadn't allowed time to build it, obviously, and according to Locke's estimates, it would have cost almost double the price for the WNR. And as for their November resolution, the GJR board must have known that in the relatively small world of Lancastrian railways, their decision would get back to the WNR. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the hammer being pulled back on the gun. But whether it was all a negotiating tactic or not, the WNR cracked. 2 months after that board resolution, the WNR directors sold their shares to the Grand Junction at face value. The GJR now had control of the whole line from Birmingham to Liverpool. Unfortunately, what they still couldn't get control over was their principal engineer. Realistically, the solution they'd landed on at the end of 1833 was never going to resolve the real issues. Removing Rastrick might have slightly clarified the previous muddy setup, but by formally appointing George Stephenson as principal engineer and simultaneously giving Locke responsibility for the whole line when Stephenson wasn't around, they'd baked in a possibility of disagreement that must have been obvious to everyone. Basically, they'd tried to paper over the cracks with banknotes and hoped the problem would go away. George, you're responsible for the whole thing, but especially the south. Oh, and in the south you're going to have an assistant who's actually responsible for it. Righto. You, Joseph, you're responsible for the north. You report to George, unless he's not here, in which case you're responsible for the whole thing, including the south. Isn't George's assistant covering the south? Well, yes, unless George isn't here, in which case, like I said, you're responsible for the whole thing, including the south. Everybody clear? Do you want £800? Yes, please. Unsurprisingly, the problem didn't go away. Beneath the money, the cracks were still there. But for a time at least, it was less apparent, as Locke threw himself into the detail. He drew designs for the viaducts on the northern portion of the line, surveyed the abortive alternative to Warrington and Newton, and concentrated on specifying the contracts at a level of detail that was unheard of up until this time. A level of detail that paid off, as we'll see in the next episode. George, on the other hand, seems to have been largely absent. Unlike Locke, he had many calls on his time, and I suspect his view from the beginning was that his role as principal engineer should be more consultative, with the hands-on work being done by able, more junior people. But it was that last point that caused the problem for Locke. With a growing sense of his own talents, which to be fair we can see with hindsight was accurate, it's not hard for us to guess that he was starting to chafe at the idea that he'd be stuck forever in his former mentor's shadow, doing the work while, in his view, somebody else took the credit. But whatever Locke's feelings on the matter, it's clear from the record that the Grand Junction Board definitely didn't think George's role was supposed to be consultative. They wanted a principal engineer who was dedicated to the line. Throughout 1834, they sent him letters pressing him to attend the board meetings, but it looks like he didn't turn up to any of them. They asked him to produce reports on the type of rails they should use and the best locomotives for the line. He gave them neither. You can imagine their frustration. After all, they were paying him £2,000 a year for the privilege of ignoring them. But they obviously felt they were in a difficult position, which makes sense. Most of these men were also the directors of the Liverpool and Manchester, where George was still famously attached as engineer, and his name carried a huge amount of weight when it was attached to proposed new lines, many of which they were also involved in. By the end of the year, though, they'd had enough, and in the November 1834 board meeting, they recorded a formal decision that's worth quoting at length. The subject of certain alterations in the engineering department having been resumed and discussed, and the chairman having reported that he had conferred as requested with Mr. Alcott, who has consented to accept the situation of resident engineer upon such part of the line as he and Mr. Locke shall agree upon, he communicating with and receiving his instructions from Mr. Locke, it was resolved that Mr. George Stephenson and Mr. Joseph Locke be appointed engineers to the company. That Mr. Locke shall undertake the preparation of all plans, specifications, contracts for the entire line. The same shall be submitted to Mr. Stephenson and signed by him before they are advertised. That Mr. Locke shall have the general superintendence of the entire line, but that Mr. Stephenson should be required to pass 10 days in every second month in surveying the works, on the state of which he shall make his report to the board. That, as all plans and specifications will probably be completed before the 30th of June 1835, Mr. Stephenson's salary up to that time shall be £2,000, without extra charge, and after that time £1,000 per annum, unless more of his time than 70 days in the year be required, in which case he shall be paid at the rate of 10 guineas per day for such extra time. That the company's advertisements as to whatever relates to the engineering department shall be published in the name of George Stephenson and Joseph Locke as engineers, and that the latter be understood to be the engineer referred to in the contracts. There's a lot of words there, but the board were obviously trying to find a compromise that would give everyone what they really wanted. They raised Locke to an equal status with Stephenson, kept paying George, and tried to avoid any public damage to his reputation by leaving his name formally on all the documents, while in reality giving Locke all of the actual responsibility. Presumably, they felt that this time they'd nailed it. They hadn't. Although George had ignored their request to write a report on the best type of rails and chairs to use, the board still wanted his input. So they asked Locke to write the report on rails and chairs, and like they'd said in their resolution, to pass it to George for him to comment. George ignored it again. Finally, in June 1835, John Moss wrote to Stephenson personally, and specifically asked him to attend the next board meeting to comment on Locke's suggestions. By this time, you can probably guess what had happened, although the Grand Junction board apparently couldn't. George didn't reply to Moss, and he didn't turn up to the board meeting. In Stephenson's absence, the board approved the rails recommended by Locke. And those rails are an interesting topic, actually, so we'll come back to them in the next episode. But 7 months after their previous resolution on their engineers, they also clearly concluded that it hadn't worked, and that the current situation couldn't carry on. 2 months later, on the 12th of August 1835, they had a meeting whose only point was to decide what should be done about their troublesome engineer. They still couldn't bring themselves to break with him publicly, so, to avoid severing all connection with him, they decided to change his role officially to consulting engineer, and replace his exorbitant £2,000 salary with a retainer of £300. They also committed to pay him a day rate for any work he actually did, although there must have been plenty on the board who weren't too worried that would cost them a lot of money. At the same meeting, they promoted Locke to the role of engineer-in-chief and raised his salary to £1,200. While that was a lot less than Stephenson had been getting, it looks as though Locke was happy with his 50% pay rise, and perhaps even more happy to finally get official recognition of the role he'd been playing in practice for the past 2 years. George, meanwhile, appears to have been no more a fan of this plan than he was the last one, but this time at least he contacted the GJR board. He sent them a resignation letter. If this one was a bluff, it didn't work. On the 16th of September 1835, the board noted the following: Resolved, that Mr. Stephenson's resignation be accepted. As a rule, 19th century board minutes don't contain many emotional outpourings, so I can't be sure of this, but given how George Stephenson had behaved, I'm willing to bet that there weren't many tears shed in that meeting. Finally, though, the GJR had clarity over their engineers, and Joseph Locke received his first principal engineer role. In the next episode, amongst other things, we'll bring ourselves up to 1837 with a look at some of the structures Locke was responsible for along his line, including the magnificent Dutton Viaduct. We'll meet Thomas Brassey, the man who would go on to become the king of the 19th century railway contractors, and we'll see how the Grand Junction handled their opening. Which leaves just one more thing to do before we go. Give you today's trivia question. What was the name of the first crew-type loco introduced by the Grand Junction in 1840? Listen to the next episode for the answer, and if you can't wait that long, then check out historyoftherailways.com, where you'll find episode show notes and the answer to today's question. So, come and join me on the next episode as we continue the story of the Grand Junction Railway. If you're enjoying the show, please like, subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can find relevant images and links to the source material I used for research on historyoftherailways.com, where you'll also find ways to support the show. If you want to get in touch, then just drop me a line at michael@historyoftherailways.com or follow us on Facebook and join the conversation there. So tell your friends to come and join us on the next episode as we get distracted, fascinated and yes, even sidetracked by the stories from the history of the railways.